Hello, peoples of the internet. My name's Serena, and I want to talk to you today about a concept that I think is quite interesting and I don't think really talked about a lot, which is really when Hollywood comes out with new movies, and I'm really making reference to science fiction movies. There are some really awesome movies out there, or at least really cool movies, that deal with a very similar or identical subject matter, and they really set the foundation for these new movies. And I think it's cool to be made aware of the older movies that deal with this subject matter before you go and see this new one. So you can kind of get you can get a more well-rounded opinion of what they're dealing with. So I thought of doing this video because I saw a trailer last week for the movie Equals. Now, there was an earlier trailer released for this movie in February, which was a lot more romantic than the one that was released last week. The release last week was a lot more gritty, dealing with this whole concept of a future where people have no emotions, and it's very sterile and yeah, it's very dehumanized. So I thought it was cool because it actually stars some fairly well-known people in Hollywood. So it stars Kristen Stewart, Nicholas Hoult, and Guy Pearce. So I thought that's kind of cool, and I'm definitely going to go see this because I'm a geek. I'm going to go see this movie. I thought it was interesting because this dystopian future where people have no emotional connections to anything or one another, whatever, they're dehumanized really, is a subject that has been dealt with previously in science fiction. And while watching the trailer, my science fiction geeky soul kind of screamed out, because the imagery and the concept immediately reminded me of other movies. So what I wanted to do here was really tell people that there are some other really cool science fictions out there that you could go and watch before you go watch this new movie, if you're at all interested in the idea of, an emotional disconnect. And the other movies deal with it in a slightly different way, and I think are interesting on their own. So I'm just going to give a couple of examples. Basically because the imagery immediately reminded me of one of these movies. So the first one I'm going to talk about is THX 1138. This movie was released in 1971 and was written and directed by George Lucas. And it's a cool concept where you have a future where people have no emotions, it's controlled by drugs, and then you have the main character and how he deals with it. That's all I'm going to tell you. I think it's cool. The only issue is it's a little bit difficult to watch because it's not really a very clear story to begin with. So you have to figure out while watching why people have to have this emotional null state, and then you have to kind of think about all the implications of that and what it means to then be emotional. And it has a really high rating on Rotten Tomatoes. It's a rating of 88% with critics, and I think that's a reflection because it is a really cool movie to deal with this concept. It's just a little bit difficult to watch, and I think George Lucas maybe kind of figured out how to do a slightly more linear storyline later, because a few years later he released Star Wars. So that, I think, is a cool movie to watch. But if you're not entirely sold on the concept of a not overly clear storyline, especially given that it's an older movie, you could also watch a much more recent movie where the imagery from the trailer Equals also very, very, very much reminded me of the imagery in this movie. And it's called Equilibrium. And this movie actually stars Christian Bale, and I'm like, holy shit, Christian Bale movie. And Sean Bean, but kind of Sean Bean plays Sean Bean. So, sorry. I think he's a great actor, but he does tend to play Sean Bean. Sorry. And it deals with the same concept of a dystopian or well-known future where you have the emotional disconnect, and again it's through drugs. And a cool side note is the writer and director Kurt Wilmer actually wanted to call the drug Librium. Now, I'm not 100% sure on this story, but I think it's a really cool story, so you should be made aware of it. He wanted to call the drug Librium, but he couldn't because there's actually already an anti-anxiety medication on the market called Librium. And he had to then he had to choose a different name, so he went with Prosium 2. Yeah, I think that's how you say it, Prosium. So I think that's a cool side story. So this movie is a little bit easier to watch. It's a little bit more straightforward in dealing with this concept, but it also has some really kick-ass fight scenes. So I don't know, I think I'm just a sucker for a really well choreographed fight scene, but this movie was fun with that. The only issue is, like, I was surprised that it had such a low rating on Rotten Tomatoes. It only has a 38% rating with critics. And I was like, meh. But audiences rate it much higher. So I think it's a really fun movie to start with if you're at all interested in this concept. And I know there's a lot more science fictions out there that deal with this concept, but I thought I'd just give a really quick shout out to these two because they're interesting and I think they're cool. You could also go and read the book 1984, which is by George Orwell and does deal with this lack of emotional connections. And I don't know whether it's really science fiction, and there's really varied opinions on George Orwell. And I think it's interesting if you want to read about it because the lack of emotions is actually due to propaganda and indoctrination rather than taking really drugs to suppress it. So it's slightly different. And that would be my recommendation if you're at all interested in the movie Equals that's coming out. Now, I know there's a whole bunch more science fictions that deal with this subject, so please, if you're interested, you can write a comment below suggesting them. I'm always up for watching science fiction movies. I love science fiction movies, and I do not have an encyclopedic knowledge of science fiction. I'm a sci-fi geek, but I don't have an encyclopedic knowledge of science fiction. So I'm always up to learn about more science fictions, especially the really obscure ones you really have to hunt for. They're cool. And if you'd all found this interesting, please like below and subscribe, because if there's anyone out there who would like to know more about these old school science fiction movies or get a suggestion, then I would love to do more of these videos. And really, thanks for watching.